everyone. It's the 21st April conference on the development of economy and society, organized as always by the High School of Economics. But this conference is very specific because according to the requirements of our new epoch, it is organized in the so-called distributed format. That's why we are meeting at the April conference at the end of May. And at the same time, it is organized, as you all understand, in online format. And of course, it has some advantages and disadvantages, but still we are now living in these conditions. Now we have one of the last days of the conference, and now we have a very interesting session within the section of world economy. And this session is called Energy and Climate, Economics and Politics. And of course, the program of this session was a little bit different initially, but a couple of speakers asked to exclude their presentations from the program, and we changed the program a little bit. And now, finally, we have 3 presentations for today. And so all the speakers are present here, and so we I hope that we will have very fruitful and very interesting discussion. The languages of this conference are English and Russian. All the presentations today will be in English, but if some participants have some questions in Russian or they want to make some comments, it may be done in Russian. If it is possible to do it in English, please do it in English, because the record of this session would be posted to YouTube channel of the conference, and the foreigners and English speakers may also have access to this record. That's why let's use English if there are no objections from each of you. Okay, I should also say a few words about timing. So we have 3 presentations, and each of you will have maximum 20 minutes for presentation. If you may be shorter, please be shorter, and we should have enough time for questions for each of presentations, at least 10 minutes for each of you for questions and answer sessions. And so I think that we may start at this point. The first report, the first presentation would be done by Irina Bakalova from Leuven University from Belgium. And the presentation is called The Distributional Effects of Different Climate Change Damage Channels and Mitigation Policies. Please, Irina.
Yes, thank you. So I will share my screen. So I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes, we see them.
Okay, good.
That's okay.
Okay, let me introduce myself and my co-author. My name is Irina, and I have recently finished my PhD at KU Leuven, and my co-author, Professor Eyckmans, is my PhD supervisor. So it's my pleasure now to present part of my thesis here. So in the work, I'm going to present studies the distributional effects of climate change and mitigation policies. So now the humanity faces a great global problem, the pandemic of coronavirus, but we have to remember that the greatest threat to our planet is still climate change, and we are still far from taking sufficient measures to mitigate it. So why is that so challenging? I will highlight 3 main reasons for that. So first, taking effectively international climate problems like climate change requires global cooperation, because unilateral action cannot solve such problems. But because of the public good nature of emission reduction effort, free riding incentives are too high to sustain an ambitious agreement. And in our work, we will analyze economic incentives of countries in climate cooperation. Then the second specific issue, feature of the problem, that benefits come far and perhaps very far in the future. So the recipients are people who don't live now, who don't vote now, who don't pay taxes, and so on. And this does not create strong incentives for policymakers to invest in climate change mitigation. In our work, we consider some intertype problems, but in fact, I will not touch it here in the presentation. And the third question, the third issue is a very high level of uncertainty, but I will touch it here as well. But the focus of the paper is inequality issues, which in fact have long been a concern in global climate policy makings. And there are two sides. On the one hand, the cumulative emissions of countries are very unequal, and they are highly concentrated, and poor have contributed less to the problem of global warming than rich countries and also rich individuals. But on the other hand, poor countries and also poor inhabitants, if we consider within country inequality, suffer more from climate change, and disproportionately more than rich, because of their exposure and because of their low adaptive capacity. And the main reason of greater vulnerability is according to the existing literature, is an inverse U-shaped relationship of productivity and other climate sensitive sectors with absolute temperature. I will describe this later also in the paper. And the fact that poor countries are located in the low latitude and are already warmer, and rich countries usually located in the middle or high latitude and are currently cooler. So, but I will talk to this later as well. So, and the aim of this research is to clarify some important drivers of distributional impacts between regions and over time. And these distributional impacts are net results of different fundamental drivers. So first, global climate change affects countries differently depending on their vulnerability, geography, and we consider several channels through which climate change affects economies. I will describe them later, but it's important to distinguish between different channels, as I will show in this presentation. So second type of drivers relates to the global climate policy cooperation and ambition level. More ambitious scenarios will result in lower climate change and therefore lower damages from climate change and impacts of climate change. And we compare cooperative scenarios to non-cooperative scenarios and do different assumptions regarding inequality aversion, some transfers and other schemes. So that is in fact the third driver, which relates to policies to reduce possible adverse impacts on inequality. So we consider two types of transfers. First type is just plain consumption transfers, which are limited to 1% of GDP, just to be realistic. And second type of transfers is implemented by means of international permit trading scheme, which is discussed a lot. So I will start with describing briefly our model. we use an integrated assessment model to study our questions. This model is a modified version of Rice model by Nordhaus and Young. And we simulate the interaction between climate mitigation and distributional impacts until the end of this century. So the model, in the model, we have the world, which is divided into 12 regions by their geographic and economic proximity. And each region is represented by a discrete time optimal growth model. And as the byproduct of production, countries emit carbon dioxide. And emissions are accumulated in the atmosphere and cause greenhouse gas effect and therefore extra warming of the atmosphere and of the ocean. And this process is described in the climate block of our integrated assessment model. The global warming process is represented as the annual average global temperature rise, but in fact it leads to changes in precipitation and frequency of extreme weather events and so on. And all these impacts, all these changes, they have impact on economic activity. They cause economic losses by different channels that I will describe our channels later, just in a few minutes. Yes, I think you can still see my screen. So here I will just briefly show our 12 regions of the world. So you can see them here on the map. So in fact, the most difficult question here, where we study the interaction between socio-economic and geochemical systems, where we don't know a lot about. We don't fully understood any of them. So the most difficult question is how to define these damages of climate change. It's not simply sea level rise, as is shown on the cartoon. It includes change in labor productivity due to higher temperatures, as already mentioned, higher frequency and severity of extreme weather events, spread of infection disease, and so on. So that's very difficult to model all these channels. So the usual way to cope with that is to assume that we just lose every period part of our GDP. But this approach is rather restrictive, and it has been criticized in the literature. So now we are trying to model the impact of climate change on the growth and on the development possibilities of economies more accurately. And we introduced two alternative channels of impact of climate change on the economy. First is productivity growth rate channel, and second is capital losses channel. So the productivity growth rate channel is based on the estimation made by Burke et al. Which show that overall economic growth is generally non-linear in temperature. And it peaks at annual average temperature of about 13 degrees Celsius. And we employ the results of this estimation to model the marginal impact of temperature rise. So here we position our 12 regions on the parabola according to the annual temperature in 2014, which is the initial year in our model. And here on the picture, we divide the regions into three groups by their initial income per capita. And we color rich regions in green, then medium income in blue, and low income in red. And we see that low income regions are located on the decreasing side and closer to the right, the parabola. So in fact, with higher temperature, they will have decrease in labor, in a total factor productivity here as we're moving further to the right. At the same time, rich regions, for example, Canada, will first experience some improvement in their total factor productivity increases. So yeah, and we include the temperature impact on TFP growth rate endogenously in the model. So second channel is climate-induced capital losses channel. So that the idea is that climate change is likely to increase the frequency and intensity of natural disasters like storms, hurricanes, heat waves, and so on, that destroy buildings, infrastructure, machines. And we don't have uncertainty here, so that we assume that extreme weather events affect part of the existing capital stock. So it's likely that with the higher temperature, more capital will be destroyed on average each period. So we translate this in the model as a fraction of capital stock after depreciation, which is destroyed each period, so that additional capital is destroyed each period. And I show it here as a dependence of depreciation on temperature rise. So the depreciation, capital depreciation is endogenously defined here depending on temperature rise. So here we see that, so on the figure we show the impact of local temperature rise on capital accumulation process. So that here we show the share of like surviving capital after depreciation and additional climate-induced losses. And we see that, for example, at 4 degrees warming, the additional climate change-induced capital depreciation is like from almost 0 for regions like Middle East or Commonwealth independent states. But on the other hand, it may be more than 2% for low-income Asia. And note that there is no, in fact, clear relationship between income per capita and vulnerability of the physical capital stock, as we saw in the previous channel, TFP growth rate channel. So not only poor regions suffer from climate losses, but also some rich regions like USA, here also among losers. So then, so I mentioned that in our model, we have 2 scenarios, right? Cooperative scenario, non-cooperative scenario. So, and the regions choose optimal investment, consumption, and abatement levels, taking into account this climate change negative externality, the feedback. So in the cooperative scenario, all coalition members maximize global intertemporal welfare function, which is a weighted sum of individual welfare functions of each region. And know that we use a concave logarithmic function, not linear utility function. So therefore, the same improvement in poor region has more wide than rich region. So to alleviate inequality, we consider interregional transfers in the cooperative scenario, which is restricted to 1% of GDP of donor country. And we compare this with no cooperative scenario, where countries maximize the individual welfare. And in this case, the climate externality is not internalized. And in fact, countries exert almost no abatement effort. So that's, in fact, almost no mitigation policy scenario. And here we consider transfers that are implemented by means of market-based permit trading with a cap of emissions equal to the emissions level in a cooperative scenario. And the distributional effect is driven by the initial allocation of permits. I come to the results. So that here you can see Lorentz curves in no damage scenario depicted in red line. So that is zoom part, right, to be able to see the difference. And we have three Lorentz curves that lie to the right, so that indicate that the higher inequality. Here we have TFP growth rate channel, so that I explained a few slides ago, that poor countries suffer more from rich countries. So this impact, this channel increases interregional inequality. So if we compare with the hypothetical no damage scenario here. Proportional, the usual traditional proportional damage channel, as in Nordhaus, increases inequality as well. The mixed channel is just mixed between capital losses and TFP growth rate. So don't touch it here. But the interesting thing that capital losses channel reduces inequality here. Yeah, we can see it here. So that so I also mentioned that some countries like the USA are very exposed to capital losses due to some extreme weather events, and that reduces inequality, although it does not really sound good in terms of like rational thinking, so that we destroy more capital of rich countries and then we have lower inequality. That's not really good way to reduce inequality. So we come in fact to equity efficiency trade-off. As we study it here also, I will show this trade-off from another also perspective. So we analyze the impact of the global cooperation and this implementation of interregional welfare transfers in this cooperation. And we analyze the impact on abatement effort of countries, optimal abatement effort in these two cases. So here I present two channels, capital losses and TFP growth rate, and solid lines refer to optimal abatement effort, which is between 0 and 1. So that's share of abatement reduction. Oh, share, I'm sorry, of emission reduction. So solid lines refer to cooperation without transfers, and dotted lines refer to cooperation with transfers. And we see that in climate-induced capital losses, optimal abatement rates are slightly higher in cooperation with transfers, because climate change affects economy. Well, yeah, in this channel, climate change reduces inequality, right? So that when we introduce additional instrument to cope with inequality, we have higher abatement rates here. However, in TFP growth rate, the optimal share of emissions is lower for all regions, and rather significantly lower for all regions except Africa, which is the poorest region. And it showed that in global welfare maximizing cooperation without transfers, rich regions may exert excessive effort in order to reduce inequality. So that to reduce inequality through lower climate change impact. So that they, because they don't have any other instrument for inequality, for income redistribution, they invest too much, more than effective level to mitigation in order to reduce inequality through lower climate change impact. Well, I hope that's clear. So that that the transfer scheme, the explicit transfers between regions is works good, but it's very difficult to implement in reality. So we consider another instrument, market-based instrument, to the national emission permit trading system. So it has some good features. It equalizes marginal abatement cost of participants and therefore leads to cost-effective abatement effort, but also it may work at the income redistribution mechanism because because it can initial allocation of allowances determine the money flows between regions. So we consider two possible initial allocation of permits. So first is emission grandfathering that maintains prior emissions. Like prior emissions increase future emissions allowances, right? So it's proportional to initial emissions level. And second is allocation according to per capita emissions. So that's equal per capita emissions allocation. In fact, it works more like welfare optimal transfers. Therefore, we'll focus here on emissions grandfathering that works slightly different. First, I want to say that global welfare reached here under this scheme is higher than in non-cooperative scenario. However, it is lower than in cooperative scenario. Even though the temperature rate is the same because the emission cap is the same. And the reason for that lower welfare is higher inequality because the initial allocation of allowances leads to flows not to lower income regions like Africa, but to regions with large emissions, initial emissions, and low marginal abatement costs. For example, like China. But on the other hand, here more rich countries can have incentives to join the system. For example, we see that here it is a difference in individual welfare between international permit system and no policy. So we see that on the right bars, they indicate the positive positive change, so that countries are better off in the system. So we see that in fact, most of the countries have incentives to join this international permit trading system, right, with some exceptions. And in fact, it is a great improvement, especially for high income countries. Countries here are arranged according to the initial income per capita. Compared to just difference between cooperation and no cooperation. Here to the same difference in individual welfare between cooperation and no cooperation, and we see that for rich countries, that's no, they don't have any incentives. They're better off in no cooperation. Yeah, than in global cooperation, right? And the poor countries, of course, better off in cooperation in all considered damage channels. So the good thing about the permit trading system that it improves incentives of countries to join the system to exert some mitigation effort. So in fact, we come to the conclusion now. Yeah. So here we show that the impact of temperature rise on total factor productivity tends to increase inequality between regions by the while the climate induced capital losses channel may reduce the inequality, so that damage channel matters a lot in terms of who loses and who wins from climate change and inequality implications. So that we studied also the global cooperation and the possibility of transfers, and yeah, results generally show strong trade-off between equity and efficiency and stability incentives, right? Yeah, the stability in design of this global climate policy. Yeah, but well-designed transfers and well-designed schemes can moderate this trade-off. So I think, well, I'm sorry, I think I'm a bit late. So that's, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Irina. Yes, we are slightly behind the schedule already, but thank you for this very comprehensive presentation. So we already have some questions in chat, and if anyone else has questions, please raise your hands. To use the button raise hand in the bottom of the list of participants.
I may ask myself.
Yes, Professor Grigoriev, please ask yourself, because it will be more convenient, I think.
I was working on international inequality and social inequality together. I can send you what we have published on it. The question is 51 or 52% Gini interregional doesn't matter. It's 51 or 52. What's the problem? It doesn't change anything globally in terms of inequality. So it's a very, as far as I understand, you're operating with trust. So the changes in inequality are very, very small. Who is losing, I understand. But the problem is, if there is any studies on how much you need to make end inequality and climate change prevention, both, or it's just because you are talking about transfers. How big are transfers?
Yes.
What about the costs of abatement?
Capital, it's transfers for what? Or just for trade, or it's capital cost for energy problem solutions?
So, okay, as I understand, so the first point was that the difference is really small. Yes, I agree that in fact, the difference is not that big. So I even had to zoom the Lorentz curve to see it. But yeah, what we show is the direction, because numbers, yeah, numbers are not precise, right, in this model, because we have a lot of simplifications overall, and we have aggregations, and we have projections, and so overall numbers here do not matter a lot, and we understand that. So it was not actually the purpose of this model to forecast exact numbers, and the purpose was to show the direction, right? So here, yeah, we just show the direction of the move. So then regarding the transfers, so the amount of transfers and so forth. So in this model, yeah, we assume that countries maximize optimal yeah, some social welfare function, global. So that's yeah, in fact, all countries assume to be better off with lower inequality overall. So they would prefer to transfer as much money as possible to low-income regions. And here we have Africa, which is in fact the poorest region. So we even had to restrict the amount of possible transfers to 1% of GDP of donor country to make it realistic. And yeah, the point is that costs are too high and changes in inequality are too low, right? So, and that, in fact, I agree with that. And we have this equity and efficiency trade-off showing that, yeah, we have some improvement in inequality, but on the other hand, we lose efficiency. And I show that from different perspectives, from excessive abatement effort, from, yeah, other things. So, in fact, I hope I could answer a question. I don't know.
Yes,
the numbers, we don't have exact numbers. That's not the idea of the model. So
well, nobody has exact numbers. No problem.
Okay, thank you. There is another question in chat. Are there any specific consideration of for Arctic communities? For instance, the cooperation between the Arctic Council member states? I think not in this model, frankly speaking.
No.
Yes, and if I actually have another question. So in your model, you consider just interregional inequality, right? So you did not consider the inequality within regions.
No.
Right? Because when you cited Chancel and Piketty, they combined both interregional and intra-regional inequality. You considered only interregional inequality, but when you formed the Lorenz curve, so in the Lorenz curve, each point is each region, right? Without taking into consideration the spread of people across within this region.
Yes, we here we say that yeah, within each region people have the same average.
So if you take US, you take 300 million people who have the same income, which is the highest in the world, right?
Yes. Yeah, of course, yeah, I understand that it may be, yeah, there are models like NICE model, nested integrated, like nested something model, which, yeah, they consider within country inequality. And they show that even within country, poor people suffer much more than rich people, in fact, by similar considerations. Yeah, but well, we don't focus on within country inequality. We only consider between regions. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. There is another question in chat. Should we consider the modern development as a level of consumption? Yeah, it is a very philosophical question. So the more we consume natural resources, the more we prosper. I think in this model, yes, right?
Yes. the modern development of the level of consumption. Like, you mean technological process, like modern development? I mean, we have some total factor productivity, but yeah, which is increasing with the technological process. So with the development of technology, we have more production, so more consumption.
You have welfare function, right, there, and you estimate welfare as a level of consumption, simply.
Utility, which is logarithmic in consumption.
Yes. Yes,
So
utility which is dependent on consumption.
Consumption. Yes, and consumption is yeah, part of the. It depends on our production, and production depends on the level of development. But we don't have natural resources because natural resources are different models. They explicitly consider the use of resources. And the rent and so forth, so we don't have it here at a different kind of model. So they really focus on natural resources usage and the fact that they are, we have only final stock of natural resources. So we don't have.
Yes, sorry, Irina, continue.
Yeah, what are the main recommendation for Russia? Well, for Russia, well, it doesn't come from this research because we don't consider any separate country. We consider international agreements and international policy. So, but for Russia, regarding our climate policy, yes, my personal recommendation would be to think more about that. But I mean, it's actually another discussion. I think we can come to this, but yes, increased consumption. I mean, I think we don't have time for this discussion. A lot of things to say.
Yes, I think that we raise the questions which are far beyond this particular report. So I propose not to make long discussions about more general issues, because yes, we discuss the particular research with particular conclusions. Thank you, Irina. We should already pass to the next presentation, I think. Thanks a lot for this comprehensive research. And now we are moving to our next presentation. It is the joint report of a number of my HSC colleagues: Ilya Stepanov, Anna Spaderova, Taisia Ovchinnikova, Daria Serova, Evgeny Muzychenko, and Natalia Agikyan. The presentation is called "What Drives Climate Policies in Different Countries." I think that Ilya would present, right?
Yes, dear colleagues.
Yes, please.
Thanks a lot for introduction. Okay, so it's a big pleasure to be a part of April conference this year, and I think it's especially important during this uncertain time. So thanks for a chance to present the preliminary results of our joint project, which we run at the Laboratory for Climate Change Economics here at HSC. So the project is unfinished, as I said. So your comments and any questions are more than welcomed in the end of the presentation. So let me start from the broader context and then jump to some specifics. So Paris Agreement is ratified already by 189 countries, and which aim to keep the global average growth below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. So the specifics of the agreement allows each country which adopts the general rule to formulate its own climate policy objectives, taking into account the capabilities and the broader socio-economic policy objectives. So national determined contributions vary significantly among the countries, and at the same time, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change acknowledge different capabilities which different countries have, and so they use the principle of different capabilities and different responsibilities for climate action and policies. So not only national determined contribution, but also international, but also national climate policy instruments vary across the countries. So it's not a big secret that ambitious emission reduction policies rarely coexist with the proactive poverty eradication policies, especially in the poor and developing countries. So there is a still limited room for decoupling opportunities. At the same time, there is a growing evidence in the literature that climate policies become more and more intertwined and sort of inframed into broader socio-economic objectives. So apart from climate change, vulnerability and risks, there are other drivers for climate policy. For example, green growth opportunities in some developed countries and the opportunities to export green technologies are outlined in the literature. It's all about renewable energy, which potentially can be a new competitive advantage for different countries. It's not a big surprise that local air pollution problem can coexist in the environmental policy framework with climate change prevention measures, because energy intensive industries sometimes are and often are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, for local air pollution at the same time. So, and it's also energy security concerns and the dependence on fossil fuels, which drives climate policy, especially in European countries, and there are some papers on that. So our study aims to classify the factors which determine climate policy and cluster the countries with regard to different role of different factors. So it's very hard to measure the ambitiousness of climate policy. So it's the big challenge for us, which we will keep on overcoming during this time. So, but we have 4 sort of indicators to assess ambition as presented in this slide. First of all, we take a look at the absolute national determined contributions, which are formulated for Paris Agreement. Most of the countries have absolute targets. Some of them have relative to GDP growth targets. In order to make these sort of targets comparable, we use the same base year. So we calculate the reduction in emission from the period 2016 to 2030. And we use carbon intensity as a general measure for all the targets using the long-term forecast of OECD. We use more general indicators, which are all prepared by global institutions and regional institutions. For example, we use ranking of EU countries' ambitions and progress in fighting climate change, which is done by Climate Action Network Europe. We also use climate policy component of Climate Change Performance Index, which is prepared by Greenwatch and New Climate Institute, and also Climate Action Network Global Initiative. We also suggest that implementation of carbon pricing initiatives can be sort of a measure of the more matured climate policy. So we take a look at how many countries in different clusters that we have used either carbon tax or emission trading scheme initiative as a part of national climate policy. So let me jump to the specific factors which we analyze. So they're all presented in this table. You can see that we first think at climate change vulnerability score by University of Notre Dame. So we suggest that highest climate change vulnerability probably leads to more active mitigation policies. So level of economic development is also taken and proxied as a GDP per capita in our analysis. So we suggest that more developed countries either can afford more costly mitigation policies or have more room for decoupling opportunities. Local air pollution, as I said, air pollution is often caused by carbon intense industries, so local pollution and climate policy often supplement each other. Energy dependency can be a driver, so objectives to reduce dependency on fossil fuel imports can contribute to more active emission reduction policy. Reliance on fossil fuel exports leave less room for active mitigation policies, so we use production to total primary energy supply ratio as a measure of energy self-sufficiency and the level of self-sufficiency of country. So if the ratio is more than 1, so the country is net exporter of energy. If it's less than 1, so the country sort of cover its own needs but not export energy resources. And we also look at renewable energy capacities and use the share of renewable energy consumption in total final energy supply. So we suggest that greater role of renewables in the energy mix in the energy consumption supports even stronger climate policies. So we used the sample of 57 developed and developing economies based on the data of 2016. So, and as a part of our analysis, we first do factor analysis, and then we cluster countries based on the results of factor analysis. So as a part of factor analysis, we apply Varimax method, which combines 6 indicators, which I have just outlined, into 2 principal components presented in the slide. So we can see that first principal component reunites vulnerability score, GDP per capita, and the local air pollution measurement of PM2.5. So all the 3 indicators are highly correlated with each other, and they are principally correlated with the level of economic growth. We also can see that first principal components includes the level of renewable energy in total final energy consumption. But the second principal component is more responsible for sort of energy related issues. So energy security and energy dependency, energy self-sufficiency and energy dependency are included with the negative sign. So they are inversely related to each other. So import to TPES ratio is inversely related to production to TPES ratio, which basically means that energy importers can barely be energy exporting and actively producing countries. So it's pretty logical that we have all these signs here. So let me just jump to the preliminary results of our analysis. You can see the big table here with the clusters of countries and the indicators and the median values for the clusters in each cell. And in the zone marked in yellow, you can see the indicators of climate ambitiousness. We also use median relative INDC. We use median Kane rating and main climate policy component of climate change performance index. And we also calculate how many countries use carbon pricing within each cluster. So you can see that based on this principal components analysis, we clusterize all the countries and split them in 4 big clusters. So the first cluster is presented by very high income countries like Austria, Germany, Denmark, with medium energy self-sufficiency. The second cluster includes countries with high income and low energy self-sufficiency, like Singapore, Japan. And the third cluster includes country with middle income but medium energy self-sufficiency, and the fourth one, low income and medium self-sufficiency. So there is a new table for like convenience like this, so we can see all the results from this table. I will just briefly summarize what we have here. So basically, we can see that most ambitious targets measured by either INDC or Kane rating or climate change performance index are set by high income countries, by the countries from the first cluster. So least developed countries or countries with a lower level of development have less ambitious targets. And tend to have weaker emission reduction goals, even though these countries are the most vulnerable to climate change, and they have the highest level of local air pollution at the same time. So apparently economic growth in this country is a fundamental objectives. And for these countries, and they prioritize adaptation practices over mitigation ones within the climate policies. So it turns out that countries prefer climate change adaptation and local air pollution prevention through development, which rarely coexist with ambitious mitigation policies. So we also have quite mixed results for energy-related indicators. So as you can see, on the one hand, we can have the countries with higher dependency on imports and fewer self-sufficiency, and they have the higher Kane rating and climate change performance indicator. But at the same time, if we compare the first and the second cluster have the higher median INDCs as compared to the first cluster with the more developed countries, but more ambitious policies if we measure this ambitiousness in terms of INDCs. So at the same time, if we take a look at renewable energy share in energy consumption, we can see that countries with higher share of renewables tend to have more ambitious policies and targets and more often use carbon pricing. So we also see that countries with a higher income per capita usually and more and fewer self-sufficiency tend to have carbon price more often in place as part of their climate policy. So these are all the results I'll just already summarized. So basically they're just outlined here. Let me jump to the limitations of the methodology and some discussions here. So of course, it's a big question, how should we measure the ambitiousness? And probably our approach has some limitations, but we keep on working and probably finding other indicators which can be the more illustrative for our specific analysis. But indeed, different indices apply different methodology, and it's hard to build a comprehensive index to measure the ambitiousness and to sort of the level of action in order for large cross-country comparisons, because different countries have different logics behind their policy. Probably some other factors are missing. For example, there are papers which outline economic and political institutions as important drivers of climate policies. So more matured institutions, economic institutions, can contribute to more active climate policies. And it's also probably the story of path dependence in some countries. So it's also a big question how to measure these types of factors. It's trade specialization, which probably should be taken into account, because countries which focus on carbon intensive exports probably could be less focused on their mitigation policies, and they could have less ambitious targets as compared to those countries which import such types of products. We cannot definitely say and judge about causality of the results which were presented. So it's all about correlations here, and other methods should be taken into consideration. So, but anyway, the results of this study open the discussion about the climate responsibility principles and approach which exist in international climate system. So willingness to reduce emission probably not determined only by the level of economic development, but also by other factors. So our results suggest that the assessment and comparison of the results and ambitiousness of climate policy should take stronger notice on opportunity costs of emissions reduction, which are different in different countries. For example, if we compare opportunity costs of emissions reduction in fossil fuel importing country, it will be by definition lower than this of the fossil fuel exporting and producing country, because the interest of the goals of energy security policy and the goals of climate mitigation policies are intertwined for the countries which are dependent on the imports of fossil fuels nowadays. So that leads me to the end of the presentation, and this kind of a provocative conclusion that probably that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change principle on differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities should be at least questioned or even revised to consider different opportunity costs which different countries face different opportunity costs. So, and different opportunity costs should be taken into consideration apart from the level of economic growth and the level of the development. So let me stop here. Hopefully I'm on time, and I and my team really welcome your questions. We're ready to answer them.
Thank you, Ilya, for beyond the time limit and for the very interesting presentation. I think it's very valuable to look at the climate policy as not something isolated from everything else, but as a determinant of many economic and social and other political conditions within different countries. And so that's why I think that it is very interesting presentation. We have a number of questions in chat. So Dmitry Timofeyev asks why you don't use historical responsibility of states during assessment of NDC ambitions. Probably short answers would be.
The only thing that we do not really focus on sort of responsibilities. I think it's a different part of research. We focus on what really drives and what makes country sort of do proactive climate policy. And it's not only sort of the vulnerability to climate change, but also other factors which we should take into account. So the responsibility, it's not really the focus of our project, but rather sort of the discussion point which we should develop further.
Okay, Maria Pologodina asks and propose some other factors that may determine climate policies, like institutional factors, democracy, sectoral structure of economy. Did you try any of them?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess this was answered more or less in the last slide already. I just wrote it before.
Okay, Maria, probably you will ask your questions personally, and it would be easier than to read them in chat.
Okay, because I actually added some later too. There is one comment which came at the very end when you talked about energy dependency, and that like if countries are dependent on fossil energy, they are importers, they can have higher climate emissions so that they actually get away from this fossil dependence, right? But I think there is some caution needed in this interpretation, because in the EU there is actually this really large example of Poland, who really doesn't like its dependence on Russian gas, but their strategy is not to invest that much into renewable energy, for example, but to stick to coal that they have in their own reserves. And coal is even worse than gas in terms of the climate impact. This is just a comment. My question was rather, when you discussed the carbon pricing, for example, how many countries adopt carbon pricing, I noticed that the EU countries fall into different groups. But what about the regional regulations then? Because the EU has this emissions trading system for all countries in the system. It's obligatory for everyone. So how does this influence your results with the number of countries in each group who adopt these policies?
Thank you for your question. I just briefly discussed the case of Poland. So I guess our analysis is able sort of to catch this heterogeneity among European countries, but because we calculate not sort of the EU INDCs, but we take a look at national strategies and calculate sort of national plans to reduce emissions. And we also use different indexes which sort of study the case of each country specifically, not as a EU. Going to the carbon pricing, yes, of course, we sort of calculate the number of countries which are included in the EU ETS, but there is also a variety of carbon pricing initiatives in the European Union. It's about 16 countries which use carbon pricing on top of EU ETS. So it's probably not the very sort of professional sort of measure, but it's used along with the others. That's why We just want to take a look how many countries introduce either carbon tax, which is already in place in 16 European countries, and we also sort of calculate EU ETS in this place. But I agree we should sort of develop this further and take a look at other instruments already in place, but they're implicitly included in the indexes, in these aggregated indexes, for example, for climate change performance index. They take a look at different sets of climate and energy policies. So we somehow take them into consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ilya. Could you launch the presentation once again? And Dmitry Timofeyev, I think, needs clarification about the carbon price column in your table. I think that it is a number of countries within each group which uses carbon price, right?
It is, yes.
Excluding the EU ETS.
Yes.
For example, Bulgaria, it uses carbon price or not?
It uses carbon price. It uses carbon tax in this case.
Additional to EU ETS.
Yes.
So for those countries who do not have any regulation except EU ETS, this is zero, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, but renewables for poor countries, including old renewables.
No, it's only sort of modern, including solar
Okay.
and wind. We do not take into account the sort of wood.
Okay.
I'm sorry, colleagues. Can I add a little bit to the discussion?
Yes, please.
It was a question about what will change in case of carbon price use if we use other measures. In our case, it won't change because clusterization in our case relies only on two factors that we chose at the beginning, and these factors are blue in our table, and yellow table, it's just considerations that we can explain, and it's just additional things. And for our case, factors are more interesting in clusterization, and the analysis won't change if we change the carbon price use in our column. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, probably I have some other small considerations that when you use renewables consumption, so it is simultaneously probably the factor for more active climate policy, but it is also the result of active climate policy, right? So maybe really look at it as a factor which determines the ambitiousness of a country.
Yeah, it's a big question, but we do not really sort of use one factor, one ambitiousness, sort of, we do not speak about this very direct causality. We just talk about patterns of how it develops and take a look more at correlations between sort of indicators and the dependent variables. It's also a big question because countries which have the larger share of renewables may have less potential to increase it further. So it's probably not only one-way direction, because countries which already have the big level of renewable energy share in their energy mix may be sort of limited with regard to capacities, with regard to other energy types of fuels. So that's also sort of controversy, probably part of the analysis.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, colleagues, do you have any other questions or comments? There are some other comments in chat, but I think it's just for consideration. It does not need any response. But if you want to respond, Ilya, please do it.
Yes. It's only solid which we do not take into account, like wood. So we calculate the only modern renewable energy types of energy and take into account this share. So it's probably the way smaller than like the general renewable energy share, which is provided by International Energy Agency. So we take a look at only on the modern type of renewable energy.
Okay, thanks. In this case, I think we should already pass to the next presentation. Thank you, Ilya, and thank you for all our colleagues to this interesting presentation. I hope that you will continue this research and will come even to more consistent and more finalized results in your research. But I think that the problem itself, that climate policy is not just the issue of or the matter of willingness of different countries to do it, but it is also as a matter of the opportunities and the state of the economies and political and social systems. It is really helpful, and I think it is absolutely right. Thanks a lot again, and we are now passing to the next, to the last but not the least presentation of today's. Irina Semykina will tell us about One Belt, One Road and One Pipeline, the new China's approach to energy security. So we are passing from soft climate issues to hard, really hard energy security issues. Please, Irina.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to join today's session because initially I was allocated to another one, and I'm really happy to join you today. But at this stage, my research focused more on energy rather than climate policy. But my current research I'm going to probably present on the next April conference is devoted to life cycle emission assessment of Russian LNG and pipeline gas. So I'm now focusing on considering methane emissions from gas supply from Russian gas, because it's kind of a very interesting topic now. As you've probably heard, the biggest LNG buyer of Singapore, Pavilion Energy, they introduced this requirement for bidding process that the new suppliers should report on the amount of emissions associated with LNG cargoes that kind of come to their ports. And in Europe also there are such, considerations that they may introduce some tax as a kind of carbon tax, as they did for coal, for example, because they still consider natural gas, even if it's a more cleaner alternative to coal, but still it's a fossil fuel. So this kind of considerations bring us to this necessity to assess emissions associated even with natural gas and LNG. But today I will talk about China mostly, and all the figures are obviously related to data and forecast made before the COVID-19 outbreak. So kind of just take it into consideration. And I would like to start with this, one of the energy security diagram, how to represent energy security. And here I tried to paint all these circles in relation to China, because if several years ago China was more focused on environmental acceptability of resources they use, they now even pay a lot of attention to accessibility, meaning not the availability of resources on global market, but also and the reliance on supply. We will look at it a bit later in this presentation. But overall, there are 4 A's of energy security, and I would say that currently China is more focusing on these 2, and we will look at it. So the outline of my presentation is just to look at China's energy consumption and characteristics of energy mix transformation. Then we will look how do different sources I mean, LNG and pipeline gas differ in their contribution to energy security. And in the third part, we will look at the prospects of Sino-Russian energy cooperation, which is quite important part. So to start, China's energy consumption is growing, but if we look at this chart, we will see that the level of per capita energy use in China is still much lower than in OECD countries. And this is the major reason why, you know, the majority of experts would say that China's energy consumption will grow at least up to 2040. And this is the energy mix. And if, you know, if you take any projections, here is the BP energy outlook and BP projections, they expect the growth of energy consumption, and they kind of expect the reduction of coal consumption, and that will be replaced by gas, renewables, and nuclear power. And you can see that they expect that hydro and oil consumption will be on the same level. And indeed, if we look at back, we will see a reduction in coal consumption here, which was replaced mainly by hydropower, natural gas, renewables, and nuclear to some extent. And out of all these sources of energy consumption, we can see the fast increase in natural gas, which now comprises like more than 7.5% of energy consumption, and also fast growing shares of renewables and nuclear energy. And but what is more important to take into account is the gas consumption by sector, because in China is a little bit different from many other countries, because in China the most of gas is consumed by industry, and when I'm talking about industry, it's mainly manufacturing and chemical industry. The second would be residential and commercial consumptions, mostly in buildings, and power generation is only the third one. But yeah, you can see that if we, there is a famous coal to gas switch policy, and this one is only related to these two bits here, and mostly to heating. Yeah, mostly to heating. Yeah, China's natural gas consumption is growing, and the local, I mean, domestic production does not satisfy this growing demand. So this is the share in red color, the share of imports, which is growing over the last 10 years, really, because after 2008, China became a net importer of natural gas. And since then, the amount of imported gas increased 15 times. And again, according to different projections, this increase is expected to be even bigger, and by 2040, the import of natural gas can increase 3 times to satisfy the growing demand for natural gas. And now we will look at different means of transportation and how China can get this gas. So in 2018, China became the second largest importer of LNG. So you can see here that Japan, China, and South Korea are 3 major world LNG importers. And so they supplied by Qatar, Australia, Malaysia, the US, and obviously, if we look at this map, Northeast Asia represent the biggest share of LNG market, I would say. And the thing here is that the volumes of LNG delivered to China are passing Malacca Strait over here, and this is this thing is called Malacca dilemma, because it's kind of one of the major issues of China's energy security, because this route is the shortest one between Indian and Pacific Oceans. So LNG carriers as well as oil tankers, they had to pass this Malacca Strait to get to China. And so as gas becoming, with LNG becoming more and more similar to oil market, we can see the same concerns around gas imports for China as it was several years ago for oil imports. So this is the security, energy security scale proposed by this Norwegian researcher, and he suggests that sea routes at a wartime obviously are the most insecure. And so China is, we can see some signs that China is trying to focus on these two options, which are more stable and secure, whatever time, not really a wartime, any disturbances which can be due to any events really. So when I analyzed this LNG and pipeline imports to China, you can see here really that Beijing doesn't rely on one or another option, because they kind of trying to sustain this balance between LNG imports and pipeline imports. And we'll see the new sources of pipeline gas coming in the next several years. So where can China get natural gas through inland pipelines? Well, there are three major directions. So from the south, China invested in these Myanmar-China oil and gas pipelines, and they invested in port of Kiaopiu here. And yeah, the capacity of these pipelines are not that big, around 12 BCM per year for gas. But gas can be delivered directly from Qatar, for example, and through this pipeline to Yunnan province in China, and then to Guangdong province, which is one of the most densely populated provinces in China. Another source for gas import would be Turkmenistan, and the pipeline which is going through Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan to Xinjiang here. And it can be, the gas can be delivered right to Shanghai through these internal pipelines, and it would be more than 7,000 kilometers from Turkmenistan to Shanghai, for example. And the northern route obviously is represented by Russia's pipelines. So talking about Russia, we can see that this intensity of Russia-China energy cooperation has been increasing over the last 10 years or so. And here I put with a question mark sign, but actually we have some news now. I will talk about it in a moment. So now the major project of China-Russia gas cooperation is Power of Siberia, which is supposed to deliver around 38 BCM per year by 2025 to China over here. So it takes gas from East Siberia fields, currently just from Tianjinskoye field. But the new project, which was discussed in the end of March, and so Russian Gazprom proposed to President Putin that they would like to start the development of this project, Power of Siberia 2. This one is quite interesting because initially the gas Power of Siberia 2 route was supposed to go through Altai Mountains here, and come to Xinjiang region province in China here. But the new suggestion is that the gas will be delivered through Trans-Mongolian pipeline right here to Hubei province, where Beijing is located. And again, most consumers are located here. So, and what is interesting, again, that for Power of Siberia, the sources of supply are East Siberian fields, but for Power of Siberia too, it will be the traditional, European direction source of gas production. So yeah, from Yamal to China. And yeah, if we combine all these possible volumes of import of pipeline gas from Russia, it may account like for almost 100 BCM per year, and it's by I need to say by late 30s probably, or even later. But again, the share of Russian contribution will be increasing, and as you can see here, this is the last year which we have for now, but 40% is delivered by pipeline gas. But with the new projects, the share of pipeline gas will again kind of balance. And yeah, so basically, yeah, I don't have time to read this, but basically the same things I was talking about. And that, yeah, China is expecting to increase its gas imports, and we can, as a country, contribute to this process. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Irina, for this interesting presentation. So, colleagues, we do have any questions? We have actually one question in chat. Ilya Stepanov asks to clarify the map where the gas routes are illustrated, and he says that it looks surprising that US LNG go into East Asia through Arctic Ocean and Northern Sea route on the map, but probably it is just for illustration reasons.
I think, yes, that S&P map is more like my fancy map, probably not exactly related to the routes. Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, colleagues, other questions? So actually, I have a question. Just to summarize your conclusions. If Russia realizes all the gas projects it plans, what would be the dependence of China on Russian gas? What would be the percentage of Russian gas in the overall gas mix of China?
Yeah, right. So if really, hypothetically, we assume that all the projects will be there in place, it may account for 1/3 of China's overall gas imports. So if you look at the EA projections, they expect like imports more than 370 BCM per year, and we can ensure up to 100. So it's a little bit less than 1/3, but it was discussed once with Alexei Maslov. He said China will never allow such a high dependency from one country, but if we look at current structure of imports, then Australia itself, it's almost 1/3, and Turkmenistan is another significant part. So I wouldn't say they signed this contract, so they kind of allowed this kind of dependency. Yeah.
Yeah, but Australia delivers LNG, and LNG is short-term contracts, so it does not matter from the perspective of energy dependency, I suggest. But pipelines is another issue that really determines the interdependency of two countries for long years. So probably with pipelines it is more complicated. But still, yes, these projects are negotiated. And probably they will take place finally. Okay. Yes, we have another question. What is the strategy of China with respect to the energy mix? You say it's moving away from dirty fossils, but what are the plans for the future contribution of nuclear and renewable energy? It is a question from Maria Pologodina.
Thank you, Maria, for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not into this renewable thing, and I have to explore it more in details. But China has many initiatives in renewables. As you probably know, they are leaders in renewable energy, and they made solar panels that cheap and affordable for the whole world, and they kind of very successful, and they also successful in deployment of electric vehicles, and they are world leaders in sales of electric vehicles, and they have this plan, Beautiful China 2050. So they trying to increase their reliance on renewable energy, but I cannot now provide you with any specific figures and projections of the share. But anyway, as you saw, the share of renewables is not that significant, and even if it will double, it is still important. But what China does, they try to focus on the most densely populated areas, and they had this, let me see, the Blue Sky Defense Plan. So they trying to focus on major top-tier cities like Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and trying to ensure that the supply of heat and electricity is based on cleaner sources, not coal. But in countryside, the situation is still different. Do they plan to rely mainly on gas? Well, as I said, it really depends on the sector you are looking at, because for electricity production and heat, they kind of, it's not their priority, because they use gas for more value added sectors like chemicals and things like that. So if it's not economically feasible to burn gas, and they can burn coal instead, which they have, they will probably more likely to use their domestic sources of coal.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions, colleagues? Probably not. I do not see any other questions. So thanks a lot, Irina, again for your presentation and for your answers to the questions. So we already finished our agenda for today, and so for the whole conference as well, at least the section of world economy where this particular session is presented. So I again want to express my gratitude to all the speakers today, and so to all those people who asked questions, who participated in discussions both orally and in chat, who listened to us. And thanks for your attention. Thanks for your active participation. We have some also remark from Leonid Grigoriev, right? Leonid Markovich.
Я хотел сказать, что спасибо, было очень интересно.
Okay. Great. Okay, thanks also from Professor Grigoriev, and thanks from everyone, I suggest as well. So I invite all of you to submit to the next April HSC conference. I hope that it won't be in online formats anymore, but probably some hybrid formats will be more standard for the future, because probably the new world will require the new standards of the conference organizing. But I think that this particular session was quite successful even online. So thanks again, and so goodbye everyone.